guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutritional information. I wanted to talk again about the glycemic index. I know I've covered this before and I know I've done a number of videos on it, but it is a very complex topic and there are many interesting aspects to it. And I wanted to cover something that I haven't talked about before, and in fact something that not many people really relate to the glycemic index. And there's I've looked into this and there's very little information out there, both in the research arena and in the mainstream as well, and that is how short chain organic acids can affect the glycemic index. First of all, what is the glycemic index? Well, the glycemic index is just a measure of the blood glucose response you have to a particular food, and generally the glycemic index is interested in carbohydrate foods, but you can give a glycemic index to a mixed meal, and the other foods in the meal will affect the glycemic index because of the particular physiological responses you have to those foods. So for example, white bread and glucose as a drink is given a value of 100, and what happens is you will go into a laboratory and you will drink about 75 grams of glucose, or the equivalent amount of glucose from white bread, and then you'll have your blood glucose response measured over a period of time. It's usually a number of hours. And that glucose response, the area under the curve, the peak value is given a value of 100, a relative value of 100, and other foods are judged based on the graph that they produce. So a food with a very low glycemic index will produce a much lower blood glucose response. The peak area will be smaller. The total area, the area under the curve, will be smaller. The peak, the initial rise in blood glucose will also be smaller. And this is how it's done in a research setting. That's an oral glucose tolerance test, and most foods are judged against. Traditionally, it was white bread or glucose. Most people now, I think, have moved to glucose, but they give a very similar response. And the other foods, the other carbohydrate foods, are judged against those, with 100 really being the highest. Glucose and white bread are given as a value of 100 because they generally give the highest glucose response, the greatest glucose response after consuming a certain amount of the foods. There are a number of factors that can affect the rise in blood glucose you get after consuming a particular food. For example, legumes have quite low glycemic indices, and the reason for that is likely that it was three reasons. Firstly, they contained high amounts of protein, and protein will slow the gastric emptying rate, and therefore that slows the rate that the starch can be broken down into glucose, because that process occurs in the small intestine, and for the process to occur, the food has to get into the small intestine through the stomach. So if you slow the gastric emptying rate by having a protein with your meal, which beans have high amounts of protein, that will therefore inhibit that process and lower the blood glucose response to that food. Beans also have high amounts of fiber, and fiber forms a physical barrier in the small intestine so that the enzymes that are trying to break down the starch or are trying to digest the disaccharides to monosaccharides, these enzymes will be physically inhibited from actually attaching to the food, and therefore there will be a decrease in the rate of blood glucose absorption. And also that physical barrier can occur next to the enterocyte. So once the glucose is formed, there's then a barrier of the fiber between the lumen of the small intestine and the enterocytes, and that further inhibits the absorption of the glucose. And lastly, legumes also have enzyme inhibitors in them, and some of those enzyme inhibitors may actually be able to decrease the rate at which the glucose units are broken off the starch, and therefore that decreases the blood glucose response. So the greater the blood glucose response you have to a food, generally the higher the glycemic index it is. And the foods we see at the top of the glycemic index are not always the foods you'd expect to see there, but there are many processed foods, processed breakfast cereals, white bread, foods devoid of fiber, foods with easily digestible starch, and those that contain certainly lots of simple sugars, including glucose. They tend to be at the top end of the glycemic index, and at the lower end of the glycemics there are foods that contain more fibre, unprocessed foods, foods that contain higher amounts of protein, and then there are the odd strange there are some foods that are in the glycemic index which for example, fructose is very low on the glycemic index, but that doesn't mean it's a healthy food. So the glycemic index is not an actual measure of how healthy the food is. It's just simply a reflection of how quickly the glucose from that carbohydrate food is able to be absorbed into the blood, which is an indication of health, and there is an implication here. One of the more recent research areas is the glycemic effects of foods. If you have a very rapid absorption of nutrients from foods, and we can include glucose in that, this may cause something called the nutrient overload syndrome, where the cells of the body become flooded with energy. The glucose is passed into the cells via an insulin transport system. So insulin is, you think of the insulin as like the lock in the door that opens the door for the glucose. So insulin is required for this glucose to get into the cells. Once the glucose is in the cells, there's a number of different fates it can undergo. But if we have this nutrient overload syndrome, there's too much energy, and therefore the cells start to oxidize some of the glucose. They start to become overwhelmed with energy, which increases the amount of free radicals in the cells, because it stimulates oxidation, which stimulates the electron transport chain, which as a byproduct will produce free radicals. And these free radicals may build up in the cells, and the cells don't like that because it's damaging to the cells. So in response, the cells may desensitize the insulin receptor, and therefore less glucose will get into the cell. And of course, if less glucose gets into the cell, that means more glucose is staying in the blood, and therefore your blood glucose levels goes up. So this is one of the problems with diets that provide high amounts of nutrients all at one time, and the main way that can occur in the diet is through the consumption of high glycemic index foods frequently. Those foods provide glucose into the blood very rapidly. That produces the nutrient overload syndrome. As a result, over time, your blood glucose levels will rise, and also you will develop insulin sensitivity. And this is what we see when we see the development of the metabolic syndrome. And the consequence of developing the metabolic syndrome is that your risk of obesity, your risk of weight gain, your risk of cardiovascular disease, your risk of type 2 diabetes, a whole raft of Western lifestyle diseases increase in prevalence for those people that have the metabolic syndrome. And this all stems really from people consuming high glycemic index carbohydrates. And the fact that white bread is given the standard, the relative standard of 100 next to basically what is glucose mixed with water, should indicate how bad white bread is for actually maintaining correct blood glucose levels. So there's a bit of an overview on the glycemic index. So what we really want to do in a healthy diet is we want to reduce the glycemic index of the foods, we want to bring them down, and we want a more gradual release of the energy from the gut into the blood, so that we avoid this nutrient overload syndrome. One way to do that is to consume smaller amounts of food more frequently. Bodybuilders learnt a long time ago, athletes have picked up on it, that if you consume smaller meals more frequently, you tend to see improvements in body composition, and you tend to see improvements in insulin sensitivity. Another thing we can do is we can alter the amount of protein in the diet. High protein diets induce weight loss, and one of the reasons they may do this is because they have beneficial glycemic effects. And another thing that we can do is obviously pick the foods that are lower on the glycemic index. But I wanted to talk specifically today about short chain organic acids. So what are we actually talking about? Well, acetate would be a common dietary short chain organic acid. Propionate, butyrate, these are organic acids are found in foods. And there is research that shows that if you consume acidic foods, or foods that contain these short chain organic acids, you may actually have beneficial glycemic effects. There's a study that I came across that, and there's actually a number of studies along this on the same trend, looking at sourdough bread. Now, sourdough bread is made in a slightly different way to normal bread, and the yeast extract that's used to leaven the bread is different to that in normal bread. And the byproduct of the microorganisms that are used in sourdough bread is that they produce short chain organic acids. So there are many of these short chain organic acids in the bread. It's a byproduct of the production of bread, and this is why it's called sourdough bread, because the taste is sour because of the presence of these organic acids. Now it's interesting that studies have looked at this sourdough bread and found that it has actual favourable glycaemic properties when compared to normal bread. And the conclusion from these studies, and I'll put one of the studies, a link to one of the studies in the comments box below this video, so you can actually read the study and see the implications. But the researchers found that this have come to the conclusion that it's this presence of these short chain organic acids that are in the bread that is actually maybe why this bread has a beneficial a beneficial glycemic curve compared with normal bread. And when you look into this and you research it, there are other studies that have also looked at, for example, citrus fruits. Citrus fruits contain citric acid. There are studies that have been done with vinegar, and some studies that are on vinegar that have been done in rats, for example. There's another study that was done with the comparison of bread that was given with and without vinegar, and the addition of vinegar, which is acetic acid, which is also one of these short chain organic acids. The addition of vinegar to this bread had a beneficial glycemic effect in terms of the fact it reduced the blood glucose levels of the subjects by 37% compared with the bread on its own. So these short chain organic acids, and perhaps it may well be the acidity, it may well be something else. It doesn't appear to be the gastric emptying rate. Some of these studies have looked at the gastric emptying rate. They found beneficial glycemic effects, but there was no difference in the gastric emptying rate. So it's possibly something else. It's not clear whether it's just the acidity, or whether it's something to do specifically with these short chain organic acids. They may have some other metabolic regulatory function. They may do something to the enterocytes in the gut. Certainly dietary fiber is passed into the colon, and one of the things that happens to the fiber there is that it's fermented into these short chain organic acids. So propionate, butyrate, acetate are produced in our colons from our gut bacteria, and they produce this from the fermentation of the fiber that we can't digest. We then absorb these short chain organic acids, and they do appear to have beneficial effects on the liver, and they do appear to have beneficial effects on metabolic regulation. And there's a number of studies that have looked at the benefits of fiber as actually being due to the production of these short chain organic acids. It's not exactly clear how they work, but they do appear to have some beneficial effects on the liver that does then have a beneficial effect on the regulation of glucose. So it may be an indirect effect. It may be that these organic acids have an effect on the liver, but that doesn't explain how in a single meal you can take acetic acid or you can take some of this sourdough bread, and you can consume it, and compared with bread that doesn't have vinegar on it, or regular bread, there is a beneficial glycemic effect. So these organic acids may well have short-term effects, but they also appear to have some long-term beneficial effects as well. And this may be one of the beneficial reasons for consuming high-fiber diets. It's a little known fact, for example, that most people assume that dietary fiber doesn't provide any energy, and that's incorrect. Dietary fiber is digested in our guts. It's just that we don't have the enzymes, the endogenously produced enzymes, to do it. We have to rely on our gut bacteria. Our gut bacteria will digest the fiber, they will ferment the fiber for us, and they will produce certain vitamins, they produce other chemicals. A whole raft of very complex chemistry occurs in the colon. The production of these short chain organic acids is one of the byproducts of that fermentation process, and we derive quite a large amount of our energy during the day, if we're on a high fibre diet, from the absorption and the utilisation of these short chain organic acids as an energy source. There have been a number of studies that have looked at the amount, and it's quite high. It could be 5 to 10%. On a high fibre diet, it might be 5 to 10% of the energy needs of a person in a day may actually come from their fibre intake. So dismissing fibre as just roughage in the food, dismissing it as something that isn't absorbed, that's not what studies are showing. Studies are showing that fibre is it certainly is digested in the gut. It's just that we don't do it ourselves. We rely on our gut bacteria, and this is one of the reasons why it's very important to have a very healthy microflora, healthy microflora colonies within our colon, because our colon is a fermentation chamber where we actually get a lot of our nutrients from the byproducts of the fermentation of a lot of the foods that we consume that we can't digest ourselves. So that's all I really wanted to say. I wanted to say that one of the things that you can think about when you're thinking about improving the glycemic index of your foods is the use of organic acids, these short chain organic acids, and the most common one that we have access to in our diet is vinegar. And like I say, studies have looked at the use of vinegar with bread, and the addition of vinegar to the bread improved the glycemic index. It reduced the blood glucose response of the bread by 37%, which is not an insignificant amount. That's quite a significant reduction in blood glucose following the consumption of bread. So if you like salad dressing, if you like putting vinegar, there's many different types of vinegar that go on salads, for example. If you're thinking about improving glycemic index, that's something to think about. The addition of salad dressing or vinegar to your salads is a very good way of incorporating some of this acetic acid into your diet, or the addition of vinegar to any of the foods that you consume if it's suitable. It may actually be providing some very important beneficial glycemic effects. So I hope that was interesting. I will put the link to the paper on sourdough bread in the comments box below this video. Please eat well, stay healthy, and protect yourself, and I'll see you soon for another video. Take care.